The world has been under the deadly and disruptive shadow of COVID for nearly 2 years. Everyone obviously wished that by now COVID would in some meaningful sense be over, but it hasn't just gone away. So what will happen next with COVID? Are infection rates going up? Are they going down? Are we getting herd immunity? Is immunity waning over time? We still have so many questions, so much uncertainty. And apart from obviously wishing that COVID would by now be over, I had also hoped that through this awful global experience, our culture of public discourse would take deep to heart just how poorly we can predict the future. In another video, I've talked about some of the mathematical reasons why it is actually impossible to make accurate predictions about many aspects of the future that we care about. But COVID has given everyone a first-hand, visceral experience of this unpredictability. And I recognize that for many, it is this very unpredictability of the future that they wish to go away. But as with so many things, we shouldn't be oscillating between the extremes of thinking that the future is predictable to giving up and thinking that it's totally unpredictable. There is a realistic and useful middle ground where we can project out various very plausible scenarios of what might happen, even while acknowledging the limits of how accurate these scenarios can be. In this video, I'm going to give a brief sense of how I think we could be using scenarios to talk about the uncertain future, and why that would be a healthier way to shape our public discussions. In a recent COVID update briefing by the UK government, the only projection of a possible future scenario was the suggestion that COVID infections could go up to 100,000 cases per day. There was no sense of by when that might happen or what might happen after that point. There was also no context as to what that meant in terms of associated hospitalizations and deaths, except in some vague implied sense of being less than last year, largely because of the vaccines. But in the absence of further explanation, they gave the impression that this possibility of 100,000 daily cases was not sufficiently worrying for them to instigate their plan B. But why? As a teacher would say, show us your reasoning. All of the data they did show was current and historical data, all of which is readily available on various government and non-government websites for everyone to view. What we, the public, don't have access to is the latest modelling and planning of the experts in government in light of everything they've learned so far. In such a press conference, I want the government to demonstrate a more sophisticated understanding of what is going on than can be found by a quick search on the web. And one of the sad lessons from COVID is that there is a long delay between infections and consequent deaths, and a delay between implementing policies to reduce the spread of the virus and a noticeable impact on new infections. So governments can't just wait to see what happens. They have to try to be ahead of the curve. Otherwise, by the time the hospital admissions and death rates are unacceptably high, there will be almost another month of such high death rates already implied by the infection rates at that time. So to demonstrate their forward thinking, I think they should have been talking in terms of the 3 or so most plausible scenarios for this winter. There's no need to pretend that they know exactly what's going to happen, as no one would believe them anyway. Indeed, a benefit of presenting 3 plausible scenarios is that it reminds the audience that you don't know which one is going to be closest to what actually happens. So let's take a look at what a presentation of 3 vaguely plausible scenarios could look like. We'll do this by using a set of incredibly simple back-of-the-envelope calculations to extrapolate from some simple intuitions about what might happen. And remember at all times, these are not expert projections. We're just looking at these to sketch out what a scenario-based discussion of the future could look like. So let's start with last winter's data as a baseline for comparison. And then alongside that, we can look at this autumn's data to date. And then we can project three very simple scenarios. Firstly, cases growing up to 100,000 and then falling off again, a scenario hinted at by the UK government. Next, cases remaining roughly constant, as they seem to have done in the UK for the last few months. And finally, a scenario in which cases drop off from today because we get lucky and finally reach some kind of herd immunity, as many people have long talked about and hoped for. And note that different people watching this video are likely to identify with different scenarios as being the most plausible in their opinion, which is good, because it means that many reasonable people's intuitions are being addressed without us having to argue about which one scenario is the scenario we expect to definitely happen. We can then make a very simple projection of deaths from COVID over this time period, using these three scenarios for cases and the assumption that deaths follow 3 weeks after the positive test. And for each trend, we'll assume that the scale of deaths in relation to cases will remain the same as they already have been in the data this autumn. So this is how these three scenarios translate into projected deaths using these simple calculations. Now, this sketch may be an extremely simple model compared to what a public health expert could present, but it already gives an additional hint of what might happen in the UK over this winter. In particular, we can see that despite the possibility of a very high case rate, these simple calculations suggest that there would be far fewer daily deaths this year compared to last. But conversely, by looking under the area of the graph, we can still see that the total number of deaths over this period looks like it could still be quite high. Last year, quite shockingly, the total deaths for this period was around 86,000 people. This year, if the cases do peak to 100,000 per day, then there could still be as many as 50,000 deaths in total over the same period. And the projection of total deaths changes, of course, depending on the projection of how fast the cases might rise up to 100,000 and then fall off again. But remember, these numbers are from an absurdly simple calculation. So it would have been really useful to see what the government's expert modelling suggests for this 100,000 cases scenario that they hinted at. And of course, the lower two scenarios project far fewer deaths. But sadly, all scenarios still suggest a significant total number of people dying from COVID in the UK over this autumn-winter period. Then, after presenting the three most likely scenarios, the policies being put in place now ought to be appropriate to handle whichever of these three plausible scenarios comes to pass. And the policies ought to be designed to influence the likelihood of each of the scenarios so that we're more likely to get one of the better scenarios. For example, mandatory mask wearing in enclosed public spaces seems like an obvious and cheap policy that is compatible with all three scenarios. Even though it may not be strictly necessary in the scenarios with the lowest cases, it is not a huge cost to bear. And by directly reducing transmission and by being a visible reminder that affects behavior, it would also actually help increase the chance that one of the lower scenarios is the one that actually happens. Also, such a sobering projection of potential death this winter from COVID would reinforce the reasons why it's so important for people who are eligible for a vaccine or vaccine booster to get vaccinated, especially when presented alongside the evidence showing that the majority of deaths from COVID these days are among people who are unvaccinated or who were vaccinated a long time ago. Now, some might argue that discussing three different scenarios is too complex for the public to understand. Keep the message simple. I recognise this argument, but I think it's wrong. I think the days when the government can act like an unquestioned authority are long over, and the public are getting ever more sophisticated in the ways in which they wish to engage with issues like COVID. And I'm not here suggesting that the government should scare people into getting vaccinated, but just that they should be open with the public about the various projections that they are genuinely looking at. After all, if we want people to take more responsibility for their own informed choices, then it is even more important for the government to present a clear picture of what their experts are thinking the most plausible scenarios will be. With all of this in mind, it was very disappointing that in their briefing, the UK government just mentioned one projected number without the context of the various scenarios that their experts must be exploring behind the scenes. And of course, COVID isn't the only issue where we're having to discuss policy options for an uncertain future. Climate change, the impacts of AI and automation, and the trends in global demographics are just a few obvious examples where there is huge uncertainty about how exactly these issues will unfold, but an urgent need to plan sensibly given the scale and impact of what might happen. And yet, too often with these kinds of issues, a lot of energy can be sunk into fairly toxic debates about whether scenario A or scenario B is the one that will actually happen. To me, a healthier form of discussion would acknowledge a range of 3 or so most plausible scenarios so that the majority of people can see their own intuitions reflected somewhere in the discussion, and we can stop arguing about which is the one scenario to focus on exclusively. Then, for sure, the tough part is to find a set of policies that work reasonably well across all of the different scenarios being considered. That's not always going to be possible, but it should be the commonly accepted goal for policymakers, as I think it's the most reasonable way to plan for an uncertain future. As for this winter, I hope we get lucky and the cases do start falling away soon. But until they do, I'll keep on wearing my mask in public indoor spaces. And I hope we can all try harder to think about and talk about the future in terms of a range of plausible scenarios. And we should insist that governments use scenario planning and show us their reasoning. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please do click on the like button below and subscribe to my channel. Look after yourselves and each other this winter, and thank you for watching.